Bonjour et bienvenue à vous si vous nous rejoignez pour la
So
première
thank you
journée
for
de cette
joining us
Académie
again
virtuelle de la Banque européenne
in
d'investissement.
the
Merci à vous
European
qui nous
Investment
suivez
Bank
depuis ce
Microfinance
matin, depuis 9 heures
Academy.
GMT. Plusieurs sessions, une
We've
première
had
session
several
pardon,
sessions. We've
d'ouverture
had
a eu lieu
a
dans la
first session
matinée. Et
this
juste avant
morning,
de
and
vous laisser répondre un
just
peu
before
à la première partie de notre sondage autour de l'impact du Covid sur les
talking about the
micro,
impact
petites et
of
moyennes entreprises,
COVID
nous
on small and
avions donc
medium
une présentation
enterprises,
du
we had
économiste senior de la BNP, Emmanuel Davradakis, d'une
our
population
economist
de
friend
moins de
who
50
talked to
ans
us about
du
the
secteur
trends
bancaire
in the banking
dans la
sector
région
in the
ouest
region
de l'Afrique
in
centrale. Pardon.
Central
Une question
and
a été
West
posée pendant cette
Africa.
présentation. Je vais
During
donc
this
vous la lire
presentation,
et donner la réponse car
we
les membres de la BEI m'ont fait parvenir. Alors, une personne a demandé est-ce que
so
la
somebody
BEI
asked
participe
us
au comité d'investissement
in
à une représentation au
the
Togo
chat.
et comment collabore-t-elle avec les banques commerciales? Alors, il faut savoir que la réponse est qu'il n'y a pas de représentation au Togo. Il y en a en Côte
We
d'Ivoire,
wanted
donc
to know
à Abidjan, mais aussi à Dakar
in
au Sénégal.
Abidjan, we had a
Donc voilà,
negotiation.
voilà pour la réponse qui a été donnée concernant cette question du public. Alors, on va poursuivre le
We're
programme
going to
de
continue
cette
with
première
the
journée
program for today
du BEI
at our
avec
academy,
une deuxième session,
where the
une
second
discussion informelle sur la Banque pour
session,
l'Afrique, le point de vue du régulateur
a
sur
second
les
panel.
tendances actuelles en particulier. Une session qui sera modérée
We
aujourd'hui
are
par
going to have a moderator,
Madame Nana Touré, qui est
Anana
la
Otouré, who
directrice
is
générale du Vanguard Institute for
Director
Governance
General
and Development, fournit
of,
donc des services de
of
conseil et une assistance
the
technique au
IB
gouvernement et aux
for
organisations
Luxembourg,
dans le domaine de la
representative.
gouvernance, du développement et de la sécurité en Afrique. Elle a près de
And
30 ans
she
d'expérience
has
dans
more
le
than
domaine
30
du
years of
développement durable,
experience
en mettant
in
l'accent sur une
sustainable
croissance
development.
inclusive et transformatrice en Afrique, en travaillant avec les principales institutions
She's
financières du
working with
développement
the
international
major financial
pour l'Afrique et
institutions
les
in
directions.
the
Au
region.
cours de sa carrière, successivement dans le secteur privé, les
She's
institutions
working
gouvernementales, les
with
organisations de
the
développement bilatérales
private sector
et
and
multilatérales comme le PNUD, la BAD et l'USAID. Elle a assumé des responsabilités stratégiques, dirigeant de nombreuses stratégies
she's
sectorielles et
worked with a great number of
sur la
strategists.
censure, l'intégration et la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable.
And she's working on the objectives of sustainable development.
Alors, elle a guidé stratégiquement la formulation et mise en œuvre de plus de 400 projets de développement multisectoriel et programmes transformateurs dans différents domaines. Alors, je vais tout de suite
So I'm
céder la parole pour
going to hand over to Nana Touré, the founder of Vanguard Institute of Government and Development.
Je vous donne la parole, Madame Nana Touré. Merci à vous d'être avec nous.
Over to you. Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you very much, the other members of the panel. It was a fireside chat, if you like, to talk about banking in West Africa and small and medium-sized companies. So the central banks in West Africa, notably the Bank of represented by Mr. Addison, the governor of the Central Bank of Ghana, Mr. Gordon Emefiele, and another colleague. We'll also have with us for the central banks from the Central Bank of Ghana, Dr. Ernest Addison. And we also have the representative from the Central Bank of the Democratic Jean-Louis Mayombe. So thank you for having joined us today for this panel. And we're going to try and to introduce ourselves. We're going to essentially try and have a conversation around strategies which we want to follow. Essentially, we're going to talk about we know that small and medium-sized enterprises have been affected by COVID, and 90% have been affected. In Africa, West Africa, we have had other problems.
Donc pourtant, temporairement déficitaire et dans un environnement de crise, l'accès au financement, plus précisément aux prêts, est devenu beaucoup plus difficile pour ces PME. Donc,
things have been very difficult for these small and medium-sized companies.
Dans l'introduction, pour avoir le point de vue, la perspective des régulateurs, et je vais m'adresser directement à M. Maxwell, Dr. Maxwell
ask
Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Ghana, to have his perspective
Dr. Ernest Anderson, Governor of the Central Bank of Ghana.
on the lessons learned.
What are the lessons learned? L'histoire que nous avons appris.
Your perspective on responding to the crisis of the COVID-19 and any lessons that you have drawn for that we can learn from you. Mr. Maxwell, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nana, and thank you to other panelists and to the listeners. Very happy to be here and to share Ghana's experience. To go specifically to the lessons learned and how Ghana responded to the pandemic, Ghana recorded its first 2 COVID cases in March 2020, which triggered a 3-week partial lockdown. So these containment measures adversely impacted on economic activity, household incomes, government revenues, and jobs as companies laid off workers. And the lockdown also led to hikes in food prices. We saw pressures in food prices leading to inflation going up. We had supply side disruptions coming in, and we had a general slowdown in economic activity from the weak demand that came about as a result of the general impact of the pandemic. Nonetheless, the pandemic also provided additional impetus to deepen financial digitalization and inclusion, which led to push further the cash light agenda in the country. We specifically, in the case of Ghana, the government undertook decisive and swift fiscal, monetary, and macroprudential responses to reduce the damaging impact of the pandemic on the broader economy. The government embarked on large fiscal stimulus packages, which included increased health and social spending, introduction of an emergency preparedness and response plan, which amounted to devoted around 560 million Ghana cedis, estimated at about $100 million at that time. And this comprised tracing, testing, treatment of citizens, and also establishment of COVID isolation centers. There was also a reduction in communication service taxes to support the social distance compliance at that time when there was a lockdown. And government also put aside 600 million Ghana cedis, a little over $100 million to facilitate support to micro, small, and medium enterprises. And to some of the very micro enterprises, this support came in the form of grants. So they were not supposed to pay back. So these were the responses that came from the government and the fiscal policy side directly. But in terms of monetary policy coming from the central bank, the Bank of Ghana, and at that time there was a huge amount of uncertainty and we were not so sure how the impact was going to happen. But what was very clear was that there will be some weakened demand in the system as a result of the impact of the pandemic. So quickly in March 2020, the Bank of Ghana lowered the monetary policy rate as a signal to commercial banks to further bring down short-term interest rate by 150 basis points. In addition to that, the Bank of Ghana also introduced raft of policy measures, macroprudential measures, to support the reduction in the monetary policy rate. First on the list was a reduction in the primary reserve requirement, or the cash reserve ratio, by 2 percentage points. And so that released equivalent of about 2 billion Ghana cedis into the system to be able to help banks to be able to lend to affected sectors of the economy, including the micro and small and medium enterprises. We also lowered the capital conservation buffer of the capital adequacy ratio. The capital adequacy ratio was 13%, 10% minimum plus 3% capital conservation buffer. So that 3% buffer was reduced by 150 basis points. That brought the capital adequacy ratio from 13 to 11.5%. That additional release also made a lot of liquidity available to banks to be able to lend to affected businesses, including small businesses that needed enough resources to be able to respond effectively to the impact of the pandemic. We also reduced the provisioning requirement of banks and other small specialized deposit-taking institutions, which included microfinance and savings and loans and finance houses. We reduced their provisioning requirement from 10 to 8% for specific or spectrum of loan categories. And we allowed banks to also grant moratorium of loan repayments to businesses in some of the worst hit sectors to ease the company distress that will come with the pandemic. And on top of that, we also suspended dividend payments by banks for the year 2020 to be able to secure capital buffers. Then in terms of policy itself, the Bank of Ghana triggered Section 30 of the Bank of Ghana Act, which allowed the Bank of Ghana to provide support in case of emergency. But when we triggered it, we used it to increase our asset purchase program and bought 10 billion Ghana cedis worth of government COVID-19 relief bond, which released resources as part of central bank support to respond to the COVID-19 to the government. And that actually helped the government to be able to have enough resources to support some of the fiscal stimulus packages that was introduced. We also removed the costs when it comes to small and micro and nano businesses and mobile money electronic payment to push the agenda. We removed the cost of transferring mobile money, minimum funds on mobile money to encourage the use of digital forms of payment. So up to 100 Ghana cedis, which is about a little under $20 at that time, transfer across all networks was free to allow businesses and individuals to be able to move funds around during the heat of the pandemic when there was lockdown. We also implemented the universal QR, the quick response code, to allow termination online without having to use cash to terminate transactions using mobile money. And then we also enforced that the banks adopted an integrated risk-based supervisory approach to be able to supervise banks during the heat of the pandemic. And last but not the least, we introduced a regulatory sandbox in the early part of 2021 to help financial services to be innovative and test new innovative ideas in a controlled environment on a pilot basis. So these measures put together help Ghana to be able to withstand the impact of the pandemic to the extent that whilst our peers had a contraction, as you put it, negative growth, Ghana came out with a growth of 0.4% in 2020 and is projected to have a quick rebound in 2021 with a projected growth of 5.1%. Prior to the pandemic, growth had averaged 7%. So we are still not there yet because 2021 we're projecting a 5% growth, but the rebound has been very quick and swift. And I think that has been a result of the measures from monetary policy, fiscal policy, and financial sector inclusion that has helped Ghana to be able to recover very quickly from the impact of the pandemic. I think I'll end here.
So from your perspective, can you give us 2 quick lessons that you have learned from this process? 2 lessons, not more. We have 30 seconds for that.
So from my perspective, 2 quick lessons is the need for economies to always build buffers before disaster strike. You had a raft of measures that we talked about that Ghana was able to implement. We were able to implement those raft of measures because the room had been created prior to the pandemic hit. We had introduced a financial sector cleanup, from 2017 that are clean up the financial sector, revoke the licenses of weak institutions, increase the minimum capital requirement for banks. So at the time of the crisis, banks and financial institutions were very well capitalized, profitable, and had the room to be able to respond and not passing on the cost of the pandemic or the impact to customers. And the monetary policy and fiscal policy was able to also support because of the consolidation effort and prudent measures that were put in place between 2017 and 2019, which was actually preparing Ghana to actually consolidate those gains. But we had to fall back on those buffers to be able to respond. So preparing
Thank you.
before at any point in time is very critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Governor. I hear you very well, the need to take certain prudential measures, the need also to take some incentives also. You mentioned very well that the drop in capital adequacy ratio, for instance. You also mentioned the need to drop the provisioning requirement from 10 to 8%, the removal of the cost of transfers for mobile transfers, etc. This is a bunch of policies and measures that could encourage lending to MSMEs. Then I'm going to give the floor to have the perspective from a regional central bank like the BCAO. Monsieur Dem, Monsieur le conseiller spécial du gouverneur de la BCAO, je vais vous demander la perspective d'une banque centrale régionale.
May I ask you the perspective of the Banque Centrale d'Afrique de l'Ouest on this perspective, the banks who replied to some questions by the EIB in 2020. We hear that we have the same rhetoric that comes regarding the difficulty for the micro, small, and medium enterprises to access financing in order to develop themselves. So therefore, we are all conscious of the importance of the micro, small, and medium enterprises who always represent the backbone of the Central African economy, and how many of these enterprises are affected. What are the real levers to boost access to the financial sector with the dynamics in place at the moment, and how do you react as a regulator, as a central bank, in order to stimulate and help the micro, small, and medium enterprises in our current context? You have the floor. Many thanks, Madam. I first want to thank the EIB for inviting the Banque Centrale d'Afrique de l'Ouest to this meeting to share experiences. I also wanted to say that one of the lessons that we have learned from the crisis is that the small and medium enterprises sector is quite resilient, because despite the shock, the small and medium enterprises have resisted. They adapted themselves, and now that we can see the end of the crisis with the vaccination campaigns, we can think that we must take some measures in order to kickstart and relaunch the activities of the small and medium enterprises so that they can benefit from this. The problem in terms of financing small and medium enterprises is a structural problem that does not date from the crisis, but well before the crisis, where financing the small and medium enterprises is a problem on the global level. Everywhere in the world, we are looking for ways to improve the activities of small and medium enterprises because of their importance in the economic fabric and the economic context. And as I've indicated, the Central Bank of West African States have a strategic fundamental option for the financing of the small and medium enterprises, and we're working on two main axes. The first one is what we call the small and medium enterprises of financing mechanism, where we're trying to improve the access for small and medium enterprises to financing, because the problem for small and medium medium enterprises is a structural problem, as I said earlier on. There are many aspects, and the main one to me is that most of the small and medium enterprises comes from the informal sector, and they do not necessarily have the relevant skills and the relevant balance sheets and documents in order to access finance, which of course limits their possibility to grow and the possibilities for grants to give them some loans. And of course, this increases the risks for banks when lending to the small and medium enterprises. So we need to work on this whole environment, first of all, in order to improve the request for loans and lending from the small and medium enterprises. We have set up small and medium enterprises funding mechanism which has a main role to fund and finance the small and medium enterprises, but the central bank will give some incitations for the banks to finance the small and medium enterprises. And yet, what we are doing, we're pushing so that we accept to give us some cash and working capital to the banks for them to finance the small and medium enterprises. And within this particular mechanism, the central bank says to the banks, if you finance the small and medium enterprises, we will give you, the bank, the relevant cash flow in order to be able to grant this funding. And this is something that for us at the central bank will take part of the loans for the banks to support the small and medium enterprises. The second pillar of this mechanism is to work on the environment, because in terms of the small and medium enterprises, we're not just talking about the financing problem, but also a capacity problem, a management problem, an organizational problem, a training problem. So we know that the states have decided to shoulder on this particular situation. This does not date from yesterday. The support of this, whether with private or public partnerships, we work with these structures. We try to organize them and to grant them some financing through some international funding and financing organizations such as the World Bank and the European Investment Bank in order for them to work better in order to support the small and medium enterprises.
Sorry, Monsieur Dem.
Mr. Dem?
Alors, peut-être que Monsieur Abdullah, si vous pouvez prendre la...
Maybe, Mr. Abdullah, if you can carry on, because we were talking about the regional perspective, and as you are from the ABEAC, if you can carry on and give us this particular perspective for regional central bank on the incitation measures that were undertaken in order to facilitate the loans to small and medium enterprises. So you can go very quickly because we already started with that discussion.
Merci beaucoup, madame.
Oh, Monsieur Abdullah, désolé, Monsieur Dem vient de réapparaître.
Mr. Abdullah, I'm sorry. Mr. Jem has come back, so we will go back to Mr. Dem so that he can conclude. Okay, I was saying that the first axis working on this environment with the structure and supporting the small and medium enterprises so that they can better play their role in supporting the small and medium enterprises for them to have good conditions in getting access to bank credits. We're also working on the diversification of the finance instruments in favor of the small and medium enterprises, and to that end, we have elaborated an act on loans in the 8 West African credit unions in order to promote the loans and also to promote the invoicing in a specific manner for the small and medium enterprises. And we're also working on systemic finance in order to promote the such institutions, which in the first place will be essentially dedicated to the small and medium enterprises and the micro enterprises in order to help them to finance their activities. And these are the two main axes in our network in order to promote such funding and financing. Many thanks.
J'entends bien ces mesures incitatives qui sont très intéressantes d'ailleurs. la mise à disposition de liquidités
Thank you very much for this presentation.
l'amélioration de l'environnement et des capacités des MPME et la diversification surtout des instruments.
As regards to diversification, certainly.
Donc, sans tarder, je vais continuer sur cette lancée régionale pour avoir la perspective au niveau
We need to have the expertise
aller du côté de l'Afrique centrale,
for Central
par la
Africa.
BEAC et avoir les perspectives de la Banque centrale.
We need to have the perspectives of the central bank on these matters.
Et Monsieur Abdoulaye, vous êtes le directeur de...
And we have the Director of Studies of Research and Statistics. Statistics.
Dire un peu sur la question de la gestion des risques. Il est clair que dans cette même étude de la BEI auprès des banques, il semblait que les banques étaient plutôt préoccupées par l'augmentation des prêts non performants et par le risque accru d'accepter de nouveaux clients.
In terms of managing risk, banks were preoccupied and worried by the non-performing loans and their preoccupations in assisting such clients. What risks can you foresee in terms of anticipating financing for the financial sector and especially for these particular areas? What are the elements that you can foresee? You have the floor. If you can do so in about 3 minutes, please. Many thanks. Many thanks, Madam Moderator. I will try, as you stated, to go quite quickly. First of all, I would like to thank the European Investment Bank for having invited the BEAC in that meeting in order to exchange on the financing of small and medium enterprises in the COVID context. And I will also want to apologize to the governor of the BEAC, who was to be a panel member, but because of previous engagements, he is not able to join us in that meeting. As for the risks that we want to mention in this context, I would like maybe to remind us of the fact that the crisis has really shaken the sub-central sub-region. We have a negative growth rate in 2020 of minus 1.7%. We have not had such a performance for a very long time. Maybe in 2016 we had a negative growth of minus 1.4% because of the petrol shock, oil shock, and this had led to the heads of states from the sub-regions to gather in December 2016 in order for all the states to sign a program with the IMF in order to sort out the public finances and also to look at the decreasing curve in the accumulation of currencies changes. I want to underline that the central bank has taken some measures in that particular context of crisis. In general, the whole of the funding and financing of all economies, as a result, the financing of the small and medium enterprises with some consequent and relevant support to the states, first of all, with a program to buy back some public equities on the secondary market of 600 billion CFA francs and some massive injections of cash flow at the banking system, which would lead the volume to go from 240 billion to 500 billion CFA francs. Despite all of these elements that have enabled us to stabilize the financial sector as well as the macroeconomic framework, we have to note that we still have some elements in particular regarding the small and medium enterprises financing, where the banks are the first ones concerned in our sub-region. And these risks, the most important risks that we can note are the risks for banks to run out of liquidity, this could be shown in three elements. First of all, the banks which are dependent on central bank finance funding could become more and more to be in that situation. With two of the banks were in that situation. Now 4 of them are in that situation. The more the banks depend on central financing rather than private resources, the more they will be affected. The second element regarding the accumulation of payments in arrears, internal debt payments in arrears. With the state in difficulty, we have noticed that the internal debt, the domestic debt, each time that the payments are not paid in time as per the scheduled payment tables, this creates some difficulties for companies and enterprises, especially for small and medium enterprises which that do not manage to recover the various payments with their tender markets, and this puts them under pressure. The third and last element is the accumulation of bad loans where banks are being confronted with that problem. And to illustrate this, we had some bad loans up to 6% and April 2021 compared to what we had in 2020. And these bad loans cause some difficulty for the banks. And they are then under pressure because of some difficulties of some economic agents to honor their obligations because of the decrease in revenue. So, in order to summarize, I would note that the main risk is in fact the absence of banking cash flow, and as a result, the decrease in microfinancing with 3 main elements. The banks which are dependent for their financing on the central banks, the bad loans which increase, and also the accumulation of arrears in payments. So globally, these are the main risks that I would like to mention to you, whilst we could also say that aside from the crisis, we are also facing some uncertainty with the apparition of the new COVID variants and a vaccination campaign that is not going very fast, because we at the sub-region level, we're at a level of 3% of vaccination. So these are the few elements that I wanted to mention to you. Many thanks. Many thanks, Mr. Director, and I thank you for these elements that you contribute to that conversation. We understand the risk and especially the accumulation of arrears, but I would like to have a regional perspective. It would be very interesting. For example, can we compare this to a national perspective? We have with Mr. Director, the representative of the Central Bank of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Director General in charge of the monetary policy, Mr. Jean-Louis Kayembe. Many thanks for joining us in this conversation. We have just heard some perspectives from regional banks in Western and Central Africa. Can you please tell us about these risks? Following what we have just been told, you were in the same region, you're members of this economic and monetary community. Can you share your perspectives regarding the risks, or the risks comparable to the regional risks in terms of systemic risks, in terms of the risks that these loans represent to the small and medium enterprises? Many thanks. You need to unmute your microphone.
Many thanks for giving me the floor. Thank you very much Like my colleagues who preceded me, I would like to thank the European Investment Bank to help us have these exchanges about financing of micro and other enterprises. It's a subject which you will be aware, as has been said. It's a problem which arises in our economies. We know very well that financing is a catalyst for economic growth. And we know that there is a role for SMEs in our economies in general. So the problem is a very old problem, which we're familiar with for some time. And the question for, on the demand side, or the small and medium-sized companies, why do they not have access? There are problems for them, and they have problems for training. They also have problems for managerial, problems with guarantees. All these problems are obstacles which arise, but do not allow these small and medium enterprises to get to finance. So in the central banks, we are trying to it's possible to help with this training. As you're aware, this problem presents risks. Obviously, banks are going to avoid certain risks. On the other side, are the resources sufficient in order to be able to finance? Although these are all factors which come into play. We want to stress on the reduction of these problems, of these obstacles. We think that possibly might have a central risk assessment to get information to banks, correct information to banks so that they can finance these SMEs. We also stress the financial education, so therefore it's a program which we have put together to improve the financial climate. So these problems are structural problems which SMEs face, and the consequences, we're aware of this. So there's an effect on growth. We've noticed that we have not been spared, and we have gone through a stage when 2019 till 2020 we've had a loss of growth, a slowing of growth, and in this context the banks were hit by this. There was a period of crisis, and the banks were rather scared to make available certain funding. But the fact that telephone, so the lack of financing, despite all the measures which had been taken, a lot of these companies nevertheless suffered. So, as we see, as the regulator, we say that there are risks for the central bank. What do we do? We went into a classification system for the awarding of credit, and therefore we're able to restructure the debts and the credits sort so that there will be a possibility of getting refunding without difficulty. So we have a problem with the late payments which were not honored. So we have taken a certain number of measures so that the small and medium-sized companies would not be penalized in this particular period. We have also the fact that during this period, all the risks which are linked to cybercriminality as well, to cybercrime, we have an opportunity as well, which we have taken to evaluate this sort of risk as well as everything else. So as regards these risks, we need to integrate this into banking regulation as well. So as a matter of governance, we also need to accept new clients in our banks. Having evaluated all these risks to see how banking regulations are going to adapt to this new situation. So this is what I can tell you as regards as the financing situation for small and medium enterprises. But I think it's also difficult, but it's also an opportunity to resolve the problems which come between demand and the financing of small and medium enterprises. Thank you very much. There are lots of opportunities. And we have a series of questions which have been posed, so we're going to go directly. Can we see
que nous soyons vraiment avant-gardistes dans ces questions-là. Alors peut-être que je vais revenir.
Well, maybe I will come back in order to have another go around the table. First of all, to the representative of the Central Bank of Ghana, Mr. Deputy Governor.
Let's try to make it around. We have barely 10 minutes left. I would like us to focus and be more forward-looking if we can. In your presentation, your introductory remarks, you mentioned digitalization, inclusive finance. And I would like to see what, in your perspective, in this era of inclusive finance and digitalization, what are the additional, risk factors or motivations on the country that could bring you as regulators to change or to improve prudential measures to adjust and adapt to the new trends, the emerging trends that are digitalization and inclusive finance? What is your take on that? Thank you. And
thank you very much, Nana.
Barely 2 minutes or 3 minutes, because I want to give the floor to all the participants on that.
Thank you very much, Nana, for that. Just want to be very brief. I think the motivations and the benefits from digitalization far outweighs the risk if the risks are properly managed. And I think digitalization is helping us to leapfrog and improve financial inclusion more significantly, able to deliver financial services to the unbanked segment of the population who hitherto were prevented based on brick and mortar and were not able to be able to access financial services. We're also able to use digitalization to get a lot more people to move into the formal sector of the economy in terms of payment of taxes. Ghana has introduced a biometric ID card. Prior to that, we had a tax identification number registration of about 5 million. And since we replaced the biometric ID card with the digital Ghana card, which is biometric, since we replaced the old TIN number of the Ghana card, which is digital, we have moved the TIN numbers to 15.3 million. These are potential taxpayers that can come into the formal system to be able to enhance domestic revenue mobilization. Whereas the fintechs are now properly licensed and regulated by the central bank, and they are driving value-added services on electronic payments that are reaching out to specific segments of the population that were completely cut off. So digitization is really a catalyst and motivation to be able to improve delivery of financial services and financial development. The risk I see is as more and more institutions, including MSMEs, get digitalized, the risk to cybersecurity threats increase significantly. And I think that it's important that we spend resources to build our cybersecurity infrastructure and directives and policies to be able to withstand that so that it does not derail the efforts and the benefits that we can get from digitalization. That's the biggest risk at the moment, and I think that's where we need a concerted effort to be able to address it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being so concise. Monsieur le conseiller spécial du gouverneur.
Mr. the Special Advisor to the Governor, you have mentioned numerization and digitalization in your presentation, and also systemic finance, and it also means that the central banks adapt to the newer trends. So what can you tell us regarding these new trends where we are even talking about financing, gender issues, climate issues? So what is the central bank ready to present on a regional level in order to adapt to this environment? If you can also reply in 2 minutes, I will very much appreciate it. Yes, okay, very quickly in 2 minutes. So we have new emerging situations that call upon the central banks, such as, for example, climate change, as well as the gender issues. Regarding climate change, what we can say is that the recent experience has demonstrated that climate change can really hit the central banks in their own mandates. For example, when we have a drought and we have a drop in the cereal production, as we have known last year, this calls upon the central banks to stabilize the prices because of the climate phenomenon. So we can also have climate events such as a flood, for example, which could lead some enterprises to go bankrupt, and therefore they cannot reimburse the banks, and therefore the climate problem can then be translated in a finance problem for the central bank. So to that end, at the central bank level, we are trying to incorporate the climate issues more and more in our studies, in the definition of our mandate, in the definition of our instruments, and we are members of central bank network for the green climate, which regroups the biggest central banks in the world and the biggest supervisory bodies in terms of climate, and we talk with other supervisors and other central banks in order to have a common position on these main problems. Another point is the gender issue. This is an essential point in terms of inclusivity, because all studies have shown that part of the most of the poorest population is made up of women, especially in rural areas. So if we want to improve the situation in rural areas and reduce inequalities, we need to target women in particular in order to improve the financial inclusion and boost activities in this sector. So we have a strategy at the union level financial strategy, and we have a specific strategy for gender issues where we are trying to consolidate financing in that area. This is what I can tell you in 2 or 3 minutes. I cannot hear you. Okay, so I cannot talk. The meeting is over? Is the meeting over? No, 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 not at all. I had my mic on mute. But I thank you, Mr. Director, a special advisor to the governor, and just for a perspective on Central Africa, Mr. Abdullah. I fear that you only have 1 minute left in order to give you your perspective, because I also have a question from one of our audience members where we will have 5 minutes. So, Mr. Abdullah, what perspective do you have in terms of digitalization, green finance, financing gender issues?
Merci, Madame la modératrice.
Well, many thanks, dear moderator.
Comme au niveau de la BCAO,
As at the BCAO level and the BSC, we have tackled this straight away, these 2 aspects in terms of climate change and the gender aspect in our different policy elements and in the different meetings that we take part in. And I would like to underline that we are elaborating, as I speak, financial inclusivity strategy. This is under progress at the moment, and the strategy takes into account these 2 aspects, the gender aspect as well as the climate change aspect. In the drafting of this strategy, I would like to tell you that the financial digitalization and payment services centers will be a very important axis, and at that level, the integral interoperability of the different payment and change platforms that we have already undertaken enable some people who do not yet have a bank account to carry out some transactions, to transfer some money, and all possible financial transactions, which enables to broaden the cover and to also help the populations which have some difficulties in accessing classic financial services, especially in terms of gender. We have a number of women who are in the informal sector, and they are targeted by this particular approach. So globally, I would have to say globally, and I will finish quite quickly, dear moderator, but globally, the main 2 axes are taken into account in the new financial inclusivity strategy, which is being drafted with the climate change aspect and the gender aspect. Many thanks, dear moderator. Okay, so Mr. General Director of the Central Bank for the Democratic Republic of Congo, can you give us your perspective on digitalization before the very last question? If you can maybe give us a 1 minute reply, because that would be interesting to have your perspective. Many thanks, many thanks. Regarding the digitalization, we are well advanced because we were in a context that was marked by different systems, private systems, and now the central bank is implementing a follow-up that has the merit to have an interoperability of all the systems. So we think that this is an element that can kickstart the progress of the operations in terms of transactions with all the systems, and we think that in terms of climate change, we are at the phase where we are gathering and collecting some information, and we think that in the next few days, after having gathered information and having established a diagnostic, we'll be in a measure to make some propositions. Many thanks. So the very last question, because we have some questions from our audience. Once again, with the perspective in the future, what kind of collaboration can you envisage with the EIB in the financial sector in favor of the micro, small, and medium enterprises, and even aside from the EIB, maybe with some banks and institutions of international financing, development sector, World Bank, who have many initiatives in terms of support for the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Can this financing be channeled to the micro, small, and medium enterprises? This is the very last question.
How do you see the perspective of collaboration with international financial institutions to support further micro, small, and medium enterprises in their promotion, in their development, investing into them? Maybe 30 seconds, if anybody can, chip in and give us, Mr. Vice Governor.
So if I got the question right, it's a collaboration with international financial institutions on on green finance. We
have very short time, I fear.
Yes. Yeah. So from the perspective of Ghana, we are really looking at our development finance institutions, and we are in the process of setting up almost about licensing a new development bank Ghana. And this is an area that I think that other international financial institutions, especially development finance institutions, including the EIB, will find this as a worthy way of partnering with our development bank Ghana to be able to access funds on a wholesale basis at a cheaper cost to deliver financial support, especially to the development sector of the economy, including some SMEs that need development financing to be able to grow in specific areas of the economy. So I think Ghana is really open. We now have the World Bank and the IFC supporting this new development bank, and I think other international financial institutions can also come in. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I feel we won't have time to go back to the other panelists. We need to wrap up. And Nicole, I don't know whether we have 1 minute for the last words from each participant. We don't. So this being said, I would like to thank you to all of you for your contributions, and hand over to Hanan for the closing remarks, if I may. Thank you very much, and thanks for the audience and for the great questions we've received so far. You have the floor, Hanan.
Thank you so much, Nana. Merci beaucoup à vous, Nana, d'avoir modéré donc cette session.
Many thanks, Nana, for moderating this session.
As
you have stated, it was a Fireside session in terms of the regulations from the central banks regionally in this area. So many thanks to you, many thanks to the members of our panel, Dr. Maxwell Oboku-Afari, Vice Governor of Central Bank of Ghana, Mr. Amadou Amgoula, Director of Research and Studies for the BOAC, and Governor of the Central Bank, not with us, and Jean-Luc Mbe, General Director in charge of monetary policy for the BCC. Many thanks to you all for these very important and very interesting points, giving us the view of the central banks of the area in terms of financing for the small and medium enterprises. We'll carry on with our program for the day, and just before we go any further and we go on our third session for the day, I will suggest once again that I will give you some poll questions regarding the different sessions that you have attended up until now, regarding the different trends that were covered in that particular Fireside session that we have just concluded, and also previously the first sessions around the banking sector trends. So we will have a short break for you to answer these questions, and I'll be with you very soon. Thank you.